I'd like to kick off by saying that I spent my entire life on data. I'm an enthusiast for data. I think it's very important that I should say that at the beginning, because I'm going to spend this talk pointing out some potential pitfalls and problems. And I don't want you to go away with the message that I'm a skeptic. I'm an enthusiast for data, the power of data, what we can achieve through analysing data. I sometimes describe statistics, and I can generalise this to data science, statisticians and data scientists, as being the modern equivalent of the Victorian explorer. We're seeing things that nobody else has seen before. We collect novel data sets, we squeeze illumination and understanding from those data and see things people haven't even thought of before, perhaps. The eminent statistician John Tukey said the great thing about statistics, and again I can generalise this to data science, is that you get to play in everyone's backyard. You can work on all sorts of things, from curing cancer to making a successful business, whatever. You get to play in everyone's backyard. And in my, I can hear a phone. There's a phone. Is somebody's phone? It's not my. Okay. There's a message for somebody. I wrote a very short book about statistics. And at the beginning of that, and this will also apply to more general data science, I said statistics is the most exciting of disciplines. I was trying to get people to understand that modern statistics, which intersects a huge amount with modern data science, doesn't conform to the sort of perception of somebody who spends all their time looking at columns of numbers. It's not like that. With modern software tools, we probe data, look at it this way, look at it that way, discovering things in it. So that's where I'm coming from. But as I said a moment ago, today I'm going to talk about something, a problem. And the problem I'm going to talk about is this one. I'm going to talk about selection bias. And let's try again. Where's the... Good. You have to hold them the right way around, otherwise... Okay, so here's the motivation behind my talk. You'll all be familiar with quotations like this. It's telling you about the promise of big data, how great big data are. This guy, Chris Anderson, the former editor of Wired magazine, is saying, forget human behaviour, forget taxonomy, ontology, psychology. He says we don't need models. We can actually observe what's going on. We can actually observe all of the data, and the numbers speak for themselves. Endless similar comments have been made by other proponents of data and the power. I'm going to argue that that's an oversimplification and it hides potential problems which we all need to be aware of. Things aren't that simple. Big data carries risks. I sometimes say that the risks associated, it carries the risks associated with small data and more. There's nothing about big data which means that data quality issues which affect small data vanish. In fact, I would say it's far worse. One of the points about large data sets is that the computer is a necessary intermediary. When I learned statistics, and indeed when anybody learns statistics, the first thing that they're taught is familiarise yourself with the data. Plot it this way, plot it that way, look at it this way, look at it that way. Understand what's going on. Look at, find, identify, think about, maybe remove, maybe don't remove anomalies. Find out what the data say before you actually get into the analysis. Clean the data. Sometimes people say that 90% of work in analysing a data set is to do with cleaning the data. And those risks apply just as much to big data, perhaps even more, because the computer's a necessary intermediary. In some sense, the data are opaque to you. You have to look at the data through the lens of particular software tools, and particular software tools are necessarily aimed at looking at particular features, particular aspects, particular views and perspectives on the data. So big data carries risks. Just the mere fact that you've got large data sets doesn't mean the problems go away. And today I want to talk about just one of those risks. This is the one, selection bias, that was in my title. So this is an outline of what I'm going to talk about. First I'm going to describe where I first encountered this problem, because this isn't taught in basic data science, basic statistics courses. Quite naturally, if you're teaching somebody a course on regression or something like that, you don't start by saying, hey look, all these problems could occur. You start by telling them what the power of the tool and how to use it. I mean, in fact, I suggest that at universities we need to have extra courses where we say, look, these problems can occur, not just with regression, but with all sorts of things. And I think we should be teaching more of that. So I'm going to tell you where I first met this problem. I'm going to try to convey how important and widespread, and indeed universal it is. I'm going to talk about some of the drivers behind it, and then just touch on what to do about it, and then conclude with a couple of more personal examples from my own work. Okay, so this is how I first met it. For almost all of my career, I've been working quite closely with retail banks, consumer banks, credit card companies, that sort of organisation. The reason I've done that is that they have very big data sets and they have very interesting data analytic problems. Even as far back as the 1980s, when I started working with one of the organisations I worked with, one of the banks I worked with, had 1 billion credit card transactions a year. So even then, we're talking about big data sets. And this example is from that work. The problem I was given is, could I build an improved scorecard? Scorecards are what the banks call, slightly different from industry, what the banks call instruments to decide whether somebody is a good or bad risk, whether they will default on a loan, for instance. It's called a scorecard, and you will build this. It's a statistical model, maybe a logistic regression model, maybe something else. Maybe a neural network, could be all sorts of things. But you'll build it using data, perhaps from an application form, data describing the person who is seeking the loan. And you will also have, for a past sample of data, outcomes. You'll know whether they defaulted or didn't default. So we've got a standard design set, standard training set, and we could build a logistic regression model, all sorts of models to do that. And I was given this task of, this is what they used to do, could I build a better one? If I'm so clever, could I build a better one? That sort of thing. But here's the problem. The data that they gave me weren't a random sample, or even a probability sample, even drawn with known probabilities, from the population of people who would be applying in the future for loans. I will illustrate. This is a graph I drew, a plot I drew at the time, so this goes back to 1984. So at the top, we've got the population of people who were invited to apply for a loan, the population of people who received a mailing. It wasn't electronics in those days, we barely had computers in those days. Some didn't reply, some did reply. Of those who did reply and were offered a loan, some refused it, some refused. Of those who did reply, some were offered a loan and some weren't. Of those who were offered a loan, some turned it down, declined. Others took it on, they accepted the loan. Of those who took it on, some defaulted, bads. Some didn't default, goods. And then it carries on. The goods, some closed early, paid off the loan early, some didn't. Of those who closed early, some sought a new loan, some didn't. And you could go on with this tree for much longer. But what I want to draw your attention to is the data I've got and the ideal data I want. What I really want to do is make an inference about people that I could send, people in the entire population that I could invite to apply for a loan. But this is what I've got. This is my design set. I've only got data on the people I took on for whom I had known outcomes, whether they defaulted or not. So if I really am interested in the population up here, by the time I get down here, I've got a subset of the population, and indeed it's not a random subset, it's gone through these opposite sort of selection steps. So it's not a random subset. So if I start to build a model on this, maybe it's not appropriate for a model for the whole population. Maybe it could be disastrously wrong. And here's a little example from the same sort of data. It's from a slightly different data set where I do have information on all the population so that I can illustrate it. So these are a number of weeks since last county court judgment. That's a judgment against you in a court of law, perhaps because you haven't repaid a loan or something like that. And what we've got is a number of weeks since the last county court judgment against you. There will be a lot down here who have never had a judgment against them. These people have had a judgment against them within the last 6 months. In the whole population, about 1 in 5 has had a judgment against them in the last 6 months. It wasn't just a random an example from the whole population. But in the design data, the data which had been selected through the process I just described, about 2 in 5 had had a judgment against them in the last 6 months. And if you go down to look at different levels of this particular predictive variable, which was used in constructing the scorecard, we find that the ratio between these change. The point here is that the data in the design set that I've got is not representative and is distorted in subtle ways from the data in the whole population about which I want to make an inference. So a very simple early example of the sorts of things I'm going to be talking about. I want to make a statement about some population, I've got a distorted set of data. So let's look at some other examples of where it occurs. First, I really want to drive home the fact that this is ubiquitous. One of the things I do when I'm doing consultancy work and somebody brings me a data set to analyse, I say, what did you do about the missing data? Now this is often very revealing because they say, first they'll probably deny that there were missing data, but then when you probe, you discover, well, they didn't think it was important, so they didn't bother to tell you about it. But as we'll see, it can be critical. So here's this example, potholes, a very recent example. You'll all be familiar, or some of you will be familiar with the Street Bump app. This smartphone app, it monitors, it's got an accelerometer in it, and when a car is driven over a pothole, a sudden jolt triggers it. And this app then automatically, using its GPS locator, sends information on where that pothole is to a central site, so that gradually they're building up details of where the potholes is and they can send people out to fix the potholes. That's great. This is a wonderful example of big data in action. It's not very subtle from a data analytic point of view, but it's potentially very powerful and useful for society. Except, there would be an except, or I wouldn't be giving this as an example. In general, lower income people are less likely to have smartphones, and indeed cars. Perhaps older people are less likely to have smartphones. So what this means is there's a distortion about where you think the potholes are, where the potholes are going to get fixed. So you're getting subtle distortions about what's going on. Nice simple example. Here's another one. Hurricane Sandy swept through the east coast of the US in 2012, at the end of 2012. And this was another very exciting application of big data. 20 million tweets were received in just a few days. You know, my car's blown away, the subway's flooded, these sorts of things. And it was described as wonderful real-time application demonstrating the power of social media because you could see what was going on as it happened. Trouble is, of course, it gives you a distorted impression of what's going on and where it's going on because most of the smartphones sending tweets are located in Manhattan. In these other places, Breezy Point, Coney Island, Far Rockaway and so on, there aren't so many. So you don't get so many tweets. So you think, oh, that's okay. Indeed, as far as you know, there are no problems there at all. In fact, the whole town could have blown away. So again, we're getting a distorted impression of where the damage occurs. It's selection bias in action. And here's, I think, a final example, just to drive home how important it is. Many of you are academics, and this is particularly relevant here. Publication bias is a term describing the distortion of what papers appear in the scientific literature. There are various factors which influence this. First, people tend not to submit negative results. Negative results aren't very exciting. I've got a cure for cancer. It's much more exciting than I haven't got a cure for cancer. This is sometimes called the file draw effect. You do a study, it doesn't produce anything exciting, you don't fight very hard to get it published, put it in your file drawer. Similar point, positive results are more interesting to editors. Editors are more likely to accept something saying, look, I made a great breakthrough then, I haven't made much of an advance. Anomalous results might be regarded as errors. You do an experiment and it doesn't conform to the well-understood theory. So you think, well, I must have mismeasured something. And indeed, that's probably the most likely explanation. But because of that, you won't submit it, perhaps. These sorts of... John Ioannidis has published several papers arguing that most scientific publications are wrong, and it's these sorts of reasons that he's based his argument on. There is distortion of what's published in the scientific literature. A final example, in an exploration of publication bias in the Cochrane database, this is a thing which carries out systematic reviews in medicine. They found various examples like this in meta-analysis of efficacy, how effective treatments were. Outcomes favouring treatment were more likely to be included than other outcomes. and indeed other examples like that. So this problem of selection bias is ubiquitous. It's all over the place. Remember the question I asked people bringing me data sets. What did you do about the missing values? So let's look at where this is coming from. What are the drivers of it? There are various drivers. One is what I'll call natural mechanisms. This is a classic, the Abraham Walden World War II bomber armour example is a classic one, and I suspect many of you have heard of this because it's often wheeled out, but it's a very nice one, so I'm briefly going to report it. Bombers would return with bullet holes in them, showing where they've been hit. And people's first reaction was, there are lots of bullet holes in the wings of this. We've got to protect that. We've got to armour the wings so that the bullets just bounce off. But then Abraham Wald pointed out that this was wrong. What was the issue was where no bullet holes were showing. If an aircraft came back with no bullet holes in the cockpit, for example, it's safe. The ones which hadn't come back are where bullets had gone through the cockpit. So it's the things where there were no bullet holes which you should armour. But the initial reaction, selection bias again. I think this is a very interesting example, not so much for the particular illustration, which I think most people know about, but for the lessons it has for other areas, like business schools, for instance. Maybe we should examine failure. We get all these people who've made billions, just sold their company for billions, and we wheel them out in front and say, this is a success story, listen to what this guy did, emulate that, and you too will be a billionaire. But perhaps what we should do is look more at the failures, because we can learn from them. And there are many other examples of this. Francis Bacon, 17th century philosopher, described an example. This isn't, so it's not new. It's not new. He described this example of being shown paintings of sailors who had survived shipwrecks and being told, look, they prayed and it worked. They survived. And he said, yeah, what about the ones who prayed and they didn't survive? They drowned. Where are their paintings? Selection bias again. So here's another little driver. Worldwide response rates to surveys are falling. This is a serious issue, and there are all sorts of speculations about why it might be the case. And it's quite serious for instance, organisations like national statistical agencies, government national statistical offices. And this is an example of how it seriously effective. This is the year 2000, this is 2015, and this is response rates to a particular UK survey called the Labour Force Survey. The dark thicker line in the middle is the total response rate over the course of time, and it is just going down linearly. It's not going to be very long before it hits zero, clearly. And these other lines are 4 waves carried out during the course of the year, and each of them are going down as well. And this is not just a UK phenomenon, it's a worldwide phenomenon. As I said, it's a serious concern to national statistical institutes because at some point, the proportion of people that you're getting information on is so low that you can't draw valid conclusions. And in any case, the fundamental issue of selection bias is this has hit 50% at this level. If you're only getting information on half of the people you're asking the questions of, what sort of distortions are going on? What sort of selection bias? Can you assume that the 50% who have answered is a representative sample of the entire population? So a serious issue. And then self-selection, a particularly pernicious example of illustration of these sorts of phenomena. My favourite example is a magazine survey which asks one question: do you reply to magazine surveys? And guess what they find out? Everybody replies to magazine surveys. And then another classic example I've put here, the Literary Digest disaster prediction of a US presidential election, very topical. 1936, Landon versus Roosevelt. They predicted that, they'd done very well in their predictions in the past, and they predicted that Landon would win. Turns out they were wrong, and if you look at the papers about this, the usual explanation is that the prediction was based on polling people who had telephones and they were non-representative of the population. So a selection bias explanation. Turns out that explanation is wrong. If you dig down into it more deeply, the actual explanation is that 10 million people were polled. The pollsters were aware of the telephone issue and the automobile, the car issue and so on. But in fact, 10 million people were polled, but only about a quarter of them replied. And again, of course, this is a self-selected sample. People decided for themselves whether to reply or not. And it turned out the anti-Roosevelt voters felt more strongly the pro. So again, we have a selection bias explanation, not the one which is generally believed to be the case, but it is another selection bias illustration. Oh, and another example, another true example, which I couldn't resist. This is another true story. The Actuary, the magazine of the Institute of Actuaries in the UK, included an editorial. Well, they carried out a magazine poll. So the magazine invited all 16,000 of the actuaries in the UK to reply to this poll, and some of them did. 13, not 13,000. 13 people replied to the poll. Talk about potential for selection bias. I have to say, it was pretty silly of the Institute of Actuaries to do this. It's a bit like my one-question magazine survey. However, to their credit, they did not go ahead and analyse the 13 responses at all. The only conclusion they drew from this was that actuaries didn't reply to magazine surveys, which is often wrong. These sorts of issues of self-selection are particularly pernicious for web surveys, because you've got the question of who's replying. You often don't have a properly structured sampling frame. You may have underrepresentations of some groups, older people for instance. You could get multiple responding. I have to say that people are aware of these problems. They've been aware of them for a long time, and there are a lot of people doing research on this to try to resolve these issues, but they're not completely resolved yet, and you need to be aware of them. Okay. My fourth possible mechanism is feedback and asymmetric information. So there's a classic example produced by a Nobel Prize-winning economist, which he called the market for lemons. And this can be described very simply. The buyer of a used car doesn't have any information on the particular vehicle he's looking at. The most he can do, the best he can do, is offer the average price of such cars. But the seller knows that particular vehicle intimately, and he can keep the better ones of that kind and sell only the poor ones. So what's happening is that because of this dynamic feedback selection process, the price is being driven down, quality is being driven down. And another little current example, crime maps. You'll be familiar with this. It was originally trialled in Chicago, and what it shows you is you can go to any town now and see where crimes have occurred, antisocial behaviour, muggings, whatever, burglaries, and you see dots. This is a map of London, in fact, showing you the worst areas for crime, which are this red colour, and the lesser ones in yellow. So this is Regent's Park, Hyde Park's down here, British Museum, Bloomsbury University College over here, Imperial College. So it's a map of London. The trouble is, you will have something similar. The trouble is, selection bias. People don't bother to report minor crime if there's no point to start with. If the police, they don't think police are going to bother to investigate, they won't bother to report it. But then, for other reasons, and an insurance company carried out a survey to look at this, and they found that more than 5 million people haven't reported crimes for fear of deterring home buyers. They won't be able to sell their house if people discover that there are a lot of crimes in this respect, fair enough. Or people won't be able to rent the house. And this has happened since the launch of this thing. And also, a quarter of people, they say, claim wouldn't report a crime for fear it would harm their chances of selling or printing their property. So what's happening here is, because of this feedback dynamic selection process, not only are the data useless for analysis, you can't look at where the crimes occur and say, this is a crime hotspot, this isn't, because for all you know, lots of things might be occurring over here, but people aren't reporting them. So you can't use it for analysis, but neither can you use it for the original purpose. You just know that there are a lot of missing values in this data and you don't know where those missing values are. So there are issues, selection bias. Okay, so what do we do about it? There are various things we can do. First, we can construct and then stick to a sampling frame. It depends on the circumstances. You can't always do this. So we might be able to use, another thing we might be able to use is gold sample. I worked with a mail order company years ago, and what I encouraged them to do, and they actually did, was to draw a sample of the rejected, the people they would have rejected. So that I could, the people they thought would be bad risks. So that now I can construct a model for the entire space. You need to adjust it after you've done, but you can do that. Registers are becoming increasingly important. Obviously in surveys of people, if you've got a national population register, you can use that to construct your survey and then standardise, you can adjust where people don't reply. This is also occurring in other contexts, so pre-registration in clinical trials. Clinical trials, people carrying out clinical trials are in many contexts now required to register the fact that they are carrying out a clinical trial. So even if it doesn't produce the result which is publishable and published, you know it was there, so it's not just missing data. In some journals require that pre-registration as a precondition for publication. There are various data analytic tools you might use, so for instance for detecting publication bias. You can look at ratios of reported results just above and below a critical value, for instance. It should be smooth across the critical value. If it suddenly jumps, something suspicious is going on. There are funnel plots, which you'd probably be familiar with, and more formal statistical tests based on them, based on law of small numbers. So large studies are likely to be published regardless of the results. Small are likely to be published only if the results are interesting. Large studies, you know, they cost you several $1 million. You're going to have to publish the results. But if it only cost you $100 to do something, well, it wasn't a big effort, didn't cost you much. If it didn't produce results, don't bother to publish it. So that you get this sort of phenomenon as a funnel plot. We've got sample size on the vertical axis going up, and we've got significance or effect size along the bottom. And you can see for large studies, we're getting sort of equal numbers on either side. But here, there's a big gap for the non-significant ones. This asymmetric shape should arouse suspicion. You can also model a selection mechanism, and I'm sorry that you're too late to win the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize was awarded for building a statistical model of what was going on, to try to model a selection mechanism by James Heckman in 2000 or 2001, for work he did in the 1970s, in fact. Having said, and other people, of course, have continued this work. Having said that, Heckman's work necessarily is based on certain assumptions. You don't observe the missing values. You want to model a mechanism. You don't know about the mechanism. You're going to have to make some assumptions about the mechanism. You might be able to get information or data on that from somewhere else, but at some level assumptions are going to come in. And Heckman's model are very sensitive to the assumptions. So a little example of what's going on here. I've got a simple regression model with a bivariate normal. I've got a response variable, I've got a predictor variable, and I'm going to try to fit a regression to that. Very simple. But I've got missing values. First, look what happens if I've got missing values in the predictor variable. So I've got a chunk here where there are no observed values of y. That doesn't matter. I can still do standard linear regression because the conditional distribution at any particular value of x is unobserved. The distribution about the mean of a distribution in the vertical direction conditional on a particular value of x is unobserved. So I can still fit a regression model in just the standard sort of way, no problem. What about when the data are selected, when they're missing in the other way? Suppose that I've got no values of the response variable above some threshold here. What now? Well, you can immediately see from this picture what's going to happen. The red line is the regression line through the whole data. The green line is what happens when, unaware of the selection process, unaware that values above y aren't observed, you just fit the regression to the observed data, and you see it's biased for the whole population. And in fact, you probably spotted that no longer is it a straight line. In fact, since there are no data points up here, And this is going to curve round and stay below this threshold value. So really, it's much more complicated because of the bias selection distortion which is going on. It's a nonlinear function now. So, some more examples. I said I wanted to conclude with a couple of examples from my more recent work, and that's what I'm going to do, just a couple of examples. Again, they're related to the credit industry, just because wonderful large data sets and so on. So, scorecards. You remember these are these statistical models to predict whether someone's going to default or not, whether they're a good risk or a bad risk, or indeed for other applications. These things need to be monitored. You want to know, the world is a non-stationary place. It changes over the course of time. We have economic crises, we have all sorts of things. Competitors appear, politicians come and go, adopt new policies and so on. So the world keeps changing. Given that, one might expect applicants for the loans to change in some way. That's going to be non-stationary. The distribution is going to be non-stationary. The competitive environment changes as well. You get new banks coming up, you get internet bank being created and so on. So things change. So you need to monitor the performance. If you construct a scorecard, you need to monitor it to see whether it's still doing as well as you thought it was. And let me tell you, it isn't. It's degrading over the course of time. Things really get better over time. It's degrading over the course of time. And you want to know, has the performance declined sufficiently that we should build a new one, we should replace it? And what you often get in this industry is enthusiasts for a new kind of data analytic tool. It used to be neural networks, then it was support vector machines, now it's extreme gradient boosting, coming along and saying, hey look, I've invented this wonderful new tool which can build a scorecard which will outdo your scorecard. So you want to compare it. You want to compare the incumbent scorecard, the one you're currently using, with the challenger scorecard. That's what we're going to be talking about. So here's my question. Is the scorecard C, the challenger, better than scorecard I, the incumbent? Now, the first thing to note, I'm talking about selection bias, the first thing to note, I'm going to get the 5 minutes. The first thing to note is that applicants are accepted if some score on the incumbent scorecard is above 0, if they are regarded as sufficiently good to be worthwhile taking a risk on. So they're accepted on the basis of the incumbent scorecard, not of the challenger scorecard. You wouldn't want to take a risk on this new one about which you know nothing. So you're only going to accept on the basis of the incumbent scorecard, which means that C and I, these two scorecards, are being treated asymmetrically. So here's a little illustration. I've got just an artificial illustration to illustrate. I've got the two scores, my incumbent scorecard, my challenger. The distribution of the goods is bivariate normal like that. The distribution of the bads, so these are the goods, these are the bads. Goods generally have higher scores than bads. But they've got identical distributions, so really, ideally, my comparison between these two methods would draw the conclusion that there is no difference between them. Neither separates the data better than the other one. That's what I should conclude. But suppose the applicants are accepted on the basis of the incumbent. So what I'm going to do is only accept those who score above this threshold. Now you can see where this is going. Same sort of problems before, only a little bit different from the one I had before. What we're going to do is compare, we've only got the data on these. We don't know what happened to these. And if we ignore that, what we're going to do is compare the marginal distributions for the incumbent along here, and we're going to compare the marginal distributions for the challenger along there. And we want to know, does the incumbent separate these two marginal distributions better than the challenger does? And I haven't put the maths up here. We can talk, I've got a paper on it if you're interested. It turns out that the separation is greater. The separation of these distributions is greater on that marginal for the challenger than it is on that marginal for the incumbent. This is bad news, because what it means is there's a bias in favour of accepting the challenger, the unknown thing, incurring the costs of reconfiguring all your software systems for something which might not really be any better. Remember, for the entire population, these two things were identical. Our conclusion should have been, there is no difference. So in this particular example, this simple selection mechanism, because it's asymmetric, bad news. And a final little example. I've done a lot of work in credit card fraud detection. And basically, again, we have an asymmetric situation. We have a stream of transactions coming in, and that transaction stream is terminated when your fraud detector device says, I think this is a fraudulent transaction. Again, it's not terminated when the challenger says, I think it's a fraud detector, when I think it's a fraud, because you don't know how well that challenger performs. You can't trust it. You don't know you can trust it yet. You're evaluating. That's the whole point. So again, we've got this data asymmetry. The standard, actually, when I started to do this, it was true that the banks were ignoring this kind of asymmetric, and now of course, they don't. In this case, it's not so bad, because, or not as serious as the other problem, because the asymmetry tends to favour, I haven't gone through the maths again, tends to favour the incumbent, and that's not so bad, because it means that should you be wrong, you won't incur the costs of unnecessarily incur the costs of replacing all your software systems, making your whole process more susceptible to fraud and so on. But there are other issues, perhaps the challenger's quicker or cheaper or whatever. So, let me conclude. I started at the beginning with a quote from Chris Anderson, the numbers speak for themselves. When people say that, the danger is that, yes, they may speak for themselves, but they're not telling you the whole story. The numbers might be lying. And the take-home message is that, what I tell clients, remember, what did you do with the missing data? You should expect selection distortion. You should model it in some way, or cope with it in some way. If you don't do that, you're risking mistaken conclusions. It depends on the context you work in. It could be loss of money, it could be loss of life, or whatever. And then I'm going to conclude. Thank you.